So like I said before, today we're going to be learning about sending APIs from your backend. So the goal today is going to be pretty simple. You know, last week we used APIs going from your front end to the API back to your front end. Today, we're going to practice using some slightly more complex APIs that have some more rules about how we use them. And so instead, we're going to have to send a request from our front end to our back end to the API, to our back end, to our front end. So we're saying that we proxy the request through the back end. Now I'm going to build a little application that's going to demonstrate some of these concepts. But instead of having you watch me type the whole thing out from scratch, I've kind of skipped some of the beginning steps for setting up a Django application. So I've created a project called noun requests. We're going to be requesting some nouns later in this demo. So that's the general name I chose for this project. Got a static folder set up with some JavaScript inside of it. And then my main app is this wishes app. We're going to be building an app that grants people wishes, so that should be fun. It's just got a couple of views at the home page and this wish route. Currently, they do almost nothing except render this index HTML. And here's our index HTML. It's got Axios loaded in from the CDN, and then also our main.js file, which currently does not do anything interesting, just going to console log hello. I'm going to start my server with run server. We'll go in my browser and just make sure, okay, cool. So that's working. I'm going to check my console. No errors, and it says hello. Okay, so I've got the basic setup. We're ready to start learning stuff. So before I dive right into just consuming APIs from the back end, I want to show you a real quick demo again of using an API from the front end, just to illustrate one of the reasons why this is important, why we need different techniques for sending data to APIs. Just a second. All right, so I'm gonna send a request to the Pokemon API again, because we've used this before. You're familiar with how it works. Okay, so pretty simple, just sending a request for a Pokemon, logging the response. Oh, I forgot a slash, so that doesn't help. Okay, great. So I send the request, I got a response, exactly what I was expecting. But it's important to note that there's a very specific reason why this works, why I'm able to send a request from localhost to a different domain. By default, there's a principle on the web, a security principle called the same origin policy, which says that you cannot send a cross-domain request. You cannot send a request from one origin to another. So the reason why it works in this case with the Pokemon API is because there's a specific header that's being set on the response. So I went over the network tab. I'm trying to look at the response that the server is sending back to me. This 55, that's that request that Axios sent. It says here the type, this is an XHR request. So I think I mentioned that in the original demo where I was talking about APIs. This is an XML HTTP request, basically means it's AJAX. Now, if I look at the response headers, This first one is the one we should pay attention to here. Access control allow origin. This is how you set exceptions to the same origin policy. So by default, no website can request data from another website. If you want to build an API and let other websites consume your data, you need to set this header, access control allow origin, and then star means any domain can use this data. So that makes sense for the Pokemon API. It's a public API. Anyone should be able to access it. So they set access control allow origin, star. This is also called cross-origin resource sharing, or CORS. And you enable CORS by setting this header. So this is the only reason why this works in this case, because we're getting the server is setting this header saying that any client is allowed to use the response. So I'm going to show you now a different API real quick that is also fairly simple, but that just doesn't set this header. And so we're going to see what the difference is, how that looks in our browser. So let's go to look for some public APIs. Let's see. I feel like I haven't had a beer in a while, so I'm kind of curious about that. I found this API here, Rusty Beer. Looks kind of interesting. But unfortunately, if you look in this table here for CORS, it says no. So this API is not going to let a browser request its data from the front end. So if I click through here, is their API, there's a little documentation for how it works. I'm interested in the different styles of beer. All these other endpoints are a little bit too nerdy for me. I'm not like that into beer, but I want to know about like the yeasts and the hops. So they've got kind of a little sandbox here for you to test it out. So I'm looking for IPAs. And it gives me a response that looks kind of like this. So that's cool. These are all the different styles of IPAs they have in this database. You know, double IPA has this description, rye IPA, red IPA. Insert your own jokes about IPAs and APIs. But yeah, so this is how the API works. It seems pretty simple. But if I try to consume it from my front end, let's see what happens. All right, so here I'm searching for all the styles of beer that have IPA in the name. You know, there's a few different types of IPAs. We will refresh the page and we get this huge error. My browser does not like this. Access to XML HTTP request from origin has been blocked by CORS policy. So it's telling me that I can't access this response because the server didn't set this header. So if they didn't set that header and I'm requesting it from a different domain, then I cannot use Axios to request this data from the front end. I'm going to need to send a request to my backend, and then my backend can request from this API and then send that to my front end again. So in order to send a request from the backend, I'm going to have to install another Python module, another library. So similarly to how we used Axios, for sending requests from the front end. I'm going to use a library called requests for sending requests from our back end. Now I'm going to apologize in advance because just the name of this library is requests, and that's very similar to the request object that we already get in Django. So there are going to be some pretty similar words on the page, so I hope we all don't get confused. Let's see, anyways, before I can actually use this module, I need to install it. So this is a pip module. I created a new tab here, so this doesn't have my virtual environment. I need to activate that real quick. And then I install requests. Cool, so that installs it. And over in my views, for requests, and then from the index, I'm gonna send a request to that same API. Say response equals requests .get Jesse?
Yeah, when we do this request calling from the backend, are we always going to use it from the views.py file?
Yeah, generally, that would be my expectation. Your front end is sending the request to some specific backend route. So you have to choose which route on your backend is going to handle that request from your front end. So here I'm being a little lazy, just doing it in the index, but normally, that would be your home page and you would have other pages that send API requests. Shun?
Yeah, is there a reason why some APIs only want you to get the data through the backend?
So in this case, I'm not sure why. I don't see any reason why we couldn't be accessing this beer from the front end. Just the API developers didn't set the right header for us to do that. But in many cases, as we'll see shortly in this demo, using an API requires keys. And so you need to keep that data private or else people can impersonate you and use the API with your account. And of course, anything that you have in JavaScript is accessible in the front end. People can just go sources or whatever, and then look at your code. So there's no way to securely put a private key in your front end JavaScript. So we're going to be proxying our requests through the back end just so we can hide our keys on the server, basically. Sound good?
Yes, thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so here I have sent a request, and it gives me a response object. So we got to remember here that this is the response from the API. It's not the response that Django is sending to the user. Let's see what we can do with this. I'm just going to print response.json. So this is a method on the response, lets me control what format I viewed the data in. I could just get the raw text, but this library is pretty helpful and it has this built-in method that will turn it into a Python dictionary. So it's a little bit easier to work with. It's kind of weird that the method is named JSON because it doesn't actually give you a JSON string. It gives you a Python dictionary, but whatever, it's quite useful anyway. So let's see what that looks like. Just going to print it right up here in my console, in this console. So when I refresh the page, it should send that request. So I'm just going to do that real quick. Refresh the page. So we're getting this CORS error from Axios, but that's fine. Cool. So this is the data from the API. You can see now it's telling me about IPAs. their gravity and whatnot. I did not get a CORS error in this case. It's the same API, the same URL even at that same API, and there's no authentication here, but now it's working because I'm sending this request from my backend. Question?
Can you remind me what line 2 is doing, the import requests?
Yeah, so requests that we use to send this HTTP request to the API, this is not built into Python. So I had to install that functionality with pip. I think we saw that a moment ago. Yeah, I did pip install requests. So that added it to my virtual environment. And then I'm able to import it to access it in this file. Just like how we've been installing and importing, Django and other modules.
Since you had to install it with the pip install, do you need would you still need to update your requirements, that text file?
Yeah, that would be a good idea. So yeah, every time you add a new dependency, it's good to update your requirements file. So now it's showing all of the different modules that I'm using in this project. Some of these we'll talk about later in this demo. Were there any other hands up, Kat?
Yeah, I see. So you have, did you just name your virtual environment requests as well? Or is the request that we're seeing in the terminal, is that related to the requests that you imported?
Good question. It is not related to the requests I imported. This is just a simple lazy name that I chose for my virtual environment. Maybe I should have chosen the same full name as my project, noun requests. But I just did it kind of short. And honestly, you should generally not name anything the same as the names for your modules. So actually, as I was developing this demo, I ran into a bug where my main project was called requests. And then this import requests line failed because Python thought I was trying to import something from my own module and not from this library I had installed. So generally speaking, you should probably not name things the same as the libraries you're using in those projects or the modules you're using. But yeah, sorry, the name of this virtual environment is not connected to this module. I just incidentally named them the same. Good question.
I have
Do
a
you have any?
question.
Go ahead.
Is there a way to name request something different? Like, could you do like import request as? Because I know you can do that with like pandas. Like,
Yeah, we could do something like that. So that's probably easier to read. So let's see, we refresh the page. Still get the same output in the console. Great. So yeah, this seems like it works just as well.
thank you.
You're welcome. All right, so now I figured out that we can use this API from our backend, so that's cool. The problem is it's really hard for me to read this response just as I'm like kind of exploring the data. I don't know exactly what I'm looking for. It's really hard for me to, read through this gigantic nested data structure. Now, if I was just doing this in the browser, I'd be able to just interactively open it up like so and just click through things at whatever depth I want. But doing things in Python, the terminal, we're going to have to use a different technique. So I found this nifty little Python module that helps you print things with white space preserved. So it's actually easier to read and has some other special features too. So I'm going to show you that so we can actually intelligently read this API output. Actually, I forgot how this works. I'm just going to Google it real quick. All right, so this is built into Python, so I don't have to install it, but I will have to import it. So pprint is pretty print. It's just supposed to make things look a little prettier. So I'm going to import it. Then we create a pretty printer, that's pp, and then we can use it. So this is kind of using an object-oriented sort of design. I can't just use the model I can't just use the module right away and call functions off of it. I have to use it to instantiate a printer, and then that printer can print things. So we'll see that real quick. So here I've made my printer and I've set some options for it. So indent2 is just changing how the text will display. Only go 2 levels deep, or I'm sorry, indent, 2 spaces every level you go in. And then depth2 means only show me 2 levels deep. So this, I think, is the most important thing in getting a readable output, is I don't want to see like 9 levels deep in the first array in the output. I want to get kind of like a general overview of the shape of the data. So I just want to see, everything, but only 2 levels deep. Okay, so now this is how the data prints out that I'm pretty printing it. So this makes it a little bit more manageable. But yeah, so now I can just access individual items from this array, from this list, send them into the template, send that data down to the client. And why don't we do that then? So let's see, is this right?
So you're only grabbing the first element of the list and then grab the description of that first element?
That's correct. I'm not such a beer enthusiast that I need to know about every beer that matches my query. I'm just going to grab the first one.
Okay.
What is the problem here?
Need to pass in what your data is going to be.
Yeah, and I was missing a comma there. I think that was the first issue.
I think a key might have to be a string also, right, in Python?
Yeah, keys got to be strings. That's the difference between Python and JavaScript. Ah, right. Oops, sorry about that. Just misclicked real quick. All right, we refresh again. Okay, so it looks like that's printing out correctly. We got the description. So I'm going to use it in my template now in the index.html. This isn't super grammatically formatted. Let's change it a little bit. Okay, this makes a little more sense. So we're taking that response from the API and interpolating it into our templates that we send to the client. So that's just to show you real quick that this API that wouldn't work from a front end, we can consume it from our back end in pretty similar ways, honestly. I feel like the code that you write for this requests library in Python is pretty similar to the code that you'll write with Axios if you're using the async await style instead of the .then style. So hopefully it's not too hard for y'all to pick this up. Okay, but now moving forward, I'm going to consume a different API in this demo, one that actually does require authentication. So let's see, where is that? Wait, this is. Here we go. So we are going to be using the noun project, which is an API that just gives you pictures of things. Basically, they're nouns, just anything. They've got a picture of it. Here are some examples, but they're just kind of generic icons that you can use in your web app. But the really nice thing about it is that you can query their API like by name. So you don't actually have to know all of the apps, all the icons that they have like up front. You can just search for like a bear or a house or something. And if they've got an icon that has that term in the name somewhere, they'll send that to you and with an image tag, put it in your website. It's really cool. So if we want to know how we can use the API here, check out the navigation. They have an API link. See, a lot of good information here. Does this get started? Now that actually takes me forward. Okay, so here's the actual documentation for this API. If you're starting to use any API, it's the first thing you need to do is read the docs because they're all a little bit different. So you can't know exactly how they work, without reading the documentation. Noun project, I think, is pretty nice docs. I like it. So I'm going to look at the getting started guide, and they're going to tell me, what I have to do and how I do these things. So first I need to create an API key. So they're telling me I got to log in, go to the app management page, generate a new API key. Okay. So I click through there. I've already signed up and logged in, but if you're going to be trying this out at home, you would have to do those steps. Go to manage apps, and they're going to ask you to create an application just so that you know what application your keys are associated with. Because imagine if you built like 5 different applications, use the same key for each of them, it would be kind of hard to tell which application is using this API the most, just for your like stats and analytics purposes. So the API asks you to declare the app you're going to use the key with. It doesn't really matter too much. I just chose a random name, API demo, and then a description that demos APIs. Click through there. So, we can get some stats on how much this key has been used. Then here are my actual keys. So the first time I was here, I had to click a button to create some keys, but now I've already got them in my account. So these are the public key and the secret key for my API account here. Now, if I want to just know how these work before I've actually built an application, written any code, they've got this handy dandy API Explorer. So I can just paste in my API key there, and then the secret key there. Let's just test it out, make sure my key works. So what I'm most interested in is searching for icons or searching for an icon by term. So I'm going to use this route. It's a very simple one, just takes a term that you're searching for. So can anyone think of a thing? Just anything.
A
Donuts.
sandwich.
Sorry, what was that first one?
I said donuts.
We've got donuts. So this is the response. Gives you a lot of information about the icon itself, when it was uploaded, the license for it. But then also, you get, doesn't have the icon URL, which I was expecting to see, but we've got the preview URL, which is still going to be plenty big. So let's just check that out. Okay, so I'll just copy that link for the preview URL. And that's my donuts icon that I just randomly requested from this API. I think somebody wanted to see pizza. And similarly, just get the URL, and then here's an icon of a pizza. Great. Just want to see this real quick.
How specific of terms are you able to put in and it still find an icon?
I don't know. What do you want to try?
Pastrami sandwich.
No pastrami sandwiches.
Whack.
Sorry.
No copy.
We do have pastrami though.
Is it limited to one word or like one term?
Let's see. Do something like. No, I don't think so. Looks like you can pass in a phrase and it'll do its best to match it. I think they just don't have pastrami sandwiches. But like this is a crowdsourced effort, you can see everything as its own author with attribution or whatever. So you can be the change that you want to see in the world and submit your own pastrami sandwich icon to this API.
Yes, John, please do that.
So much of technology is open source. You can contribute. So yeah, looks like I feel like I understand how this API works now after testing it out in the sandbox. So I'm gonna try to use it in my own code now, but I gotta go back to the documentation because I still have no idea how to do that. Tell me I need to authenticate using Oauth. Joe, question?
Yeah, I'm sorry. I'm a little lost. When you were testing that out, how did you know that it was working?
I'm sorry, when I was testing this out,
Yeah.
just because I got a response here at all.
Oh, gotcha. Okay.
So let me show you here. If I just delete the key, it's supposed to have a public key and a private key, but if I don't supply the private key and try to send a request, get a response 403 forbidden because I'm not
Okay.
authenticated.
That makes more sense. Thank you.
Yep, good question. I always like to show things failing, so you understand what that looks like. You can recognize it and fix it when it happens.
Hey Raphael, what is the slug?
A slug is like kind of a replacement for an ID, I guess. So the original usage of it, or at least the first place I've ever heard of this, is in like blogs, for example. So imagine every post has an ID number. So as we've already showed you, you can build you can build your URLs so people go to myblog.com/5 and that shows them the 5th blog post. But some people don't like using numbers in the URL for the parameters, and they would rather that every blog post has its own unique URL. So sometimes, people will set it up on the back end so that you can use a phrase instead of an ID number, and that's called a slug. So the slug is like a short phrase that can be used to identify an article, probably like a shortened version of the title generally, but it's something that you can put in the URL to request that article instead of the ID so that the URL looks a little bit prettier. It's not something I think you need to worry too hard about. Any other questions? No? All right. Okay, so it's telling me I need to authenticate with OAuth. Maybe I'm not sure what that is. Maybe if I keep reading though, all will become clear. Making requests, tell me I just send the request to this URL. So that's simple enough. Describing the responses you get back. So it'll tell me, you know, if it was successful or what the problem was. Blah, blah. Okay, best part of all, sample code. So you might notice for one thing that the sample code that they give is only for backend languages. So like Python, Ruby, and then they have community tools here for Node, Ruby, PHP, Elixir, Python. Nothing here supports JavaScript, front-end JavaScript. So even in the documentation, they are assuming that you're using some backend language to consume this API. All right, but anyways, here's a pretty useful looking snippet. I'm just going to copy paste this into my code and then make changes as necessary. I've already imported the requests module, so I don't need that. Excuse me. So we've got this one new module, requests OAuth lib. Now the docs told me that I need to authenticate with OAuth. So I'm going to assume that this library is what's going to help me do that. So again, got a new library I'm using here. So I need to install requests OAuth lib. Now we do the pip freeze again. So that updates my dependencies. All right, so I'm going to put this into a new route just so we don't clutter up the homepage. So again, this app is all about granting your wishes. So we're going to use the noun project to show you anything you could desire that is in their database already. All right, so I didn't call this requests, called it HTTP client. It's the same library, but I just used an alias for it, so that's what I have to call it. So just like before, I'm passing in the URL or the endpoint that I wanted to request. So here it's for the noun project, but now there's an extra argument I'm passing into HTTP client.get, which is the auth. So OAuth, I'm calling this function, passing in my key and my secret, and it generates this auth object that I can use to authenticate this request. And I'm just going to make another template real quick for it to render. Okay, that's good enough for now. Before I'm concerned about sending this response back to the client, I just want to make sure that I can actually view it on the front end here, or I'm sorry, on the back end here, that the response actually works. Again, I'm going to use my pretty printer. It's already been declared up here. Yeah, let's try that out. So now I'm going to go to my new page /wish. So it's not going to do anything interesting in my browser, but I had some logs in Python. So let's check those out. Okay, so I did get a response. It's telling me 401 unauthorized. Does anyone have any clues about why I got this error message? Andrew?
You didn't put in your key and
You didn't
secret.
put in your key and secret.
Yeah, this is definitely not my key. Okay, so let's actually put that in real quick.
I did have a question kind of related though.
Yep.
The object that you get. So when you're sending the HTTP client.get requests, it's just returning to you just an object, right?
Yeah, this response, it's an object, has various methods on it that let me access the data, like if I want in plain text or in JSON, or there are probably other things I can do with it. I haven't
So
looked too deep.
So in the thing above, when you did response to JSON, you're taking that regular object, which is like language immaterial, and JSON is like switching it to like a JavaScript format. I don't really understand what JSON does or like what it is.
It gives you a dictionary is what it is. So let's see here.
JSON kind of looks like a dictionary.
It does look like a dictionary. The
But it's
critical
not
difference.
technically a dictionary.
Pardon? So yeah, it does look like a dictionary. The critical difference is that JSON is technically a string, whereas a dictionary is an object. So I think it's a little bit strange that this method is called .json, but this is what I use to get a dictionary out of the response that I can use easily in Python. So yeah, I'm printing the type of the response. All right, so the response is of type response. JSON equals JSON. We refresh again. Oh yeah, it's just telling me I got a 403 error. Oh, because if I get a 403 error, it doesn't actually send any JSON to me. So let's actually make this a proper request, and then we'll try this again. So I need to also give them my secret key. Okay, so yeah, it's just a dictionary. So that kind of defies my expectations. If I'm calling a method called .json, I really expect it to give me a string back. But for some reason, that's not how this library works. So it's good that you read the documentation sometimes, or just check types on things in your code.
One good thing about VS Code, like you can highlight it and give like a quick description of it, kind of tell you what it should return and all that good jazz.
Yeah, this is definitely good to look at. Sometimes I find that it's really generic, and so it's not like super helpful. But it's good to pay attention to. Yeah, so like this always frustrates me, just the tooltip for console.log, just like telling you that you can pass anything into it. Like, yeah, I know that. You didn't need to tell me that every time I write a console log. John?
So instead of content, wouldn't you do response.text?
Yeah.
Because otherwise you get some weird, because I set mine on a debugger, I get some weird formatting. It's not, doesn't look like JSON from
Yeah, I
content,
think
from text.
content is the raw text. So I definitely want to change this. Actually, we'll just print the response JSON. Okay, so this is the response from the API as we see it in Python. It's a dictionary with one key called icon, and then it's got all these properties inside of it. Most importantly, the preview URL. So that's going to have the actual link to the icon. So let's say URL equals, now we got to dig in. So first we have to access response JSON. So it's a dictionary with one property. It's the icon, which is itself a dictionary with many properties. So we want the preview URL. And let me just print that real quick, make sure that that is actually what I think it is. Cool, that looks right. All right. All right, so if I've set this up correctly, we should be able to send the icon URL down to the front end, and then the client will be able to request that URL in an IMG tag. So let's see, no, it does not seem to be working.
Does that have to be double bracket?
It is double brackets. Forgive me, I've used like 11 templating systems throughout my career, and they're all just like different combinations of double single brackets and hashes and dollar signs and stuff. Okay, cool, much better. So now we're requesting an icon from the API. We're able to pick that one URL out of the response and then just dump it onto the page here.
Basically, your wishes are trash is what it's telling us.
That does seem to be the case. That That's not very ambitious, though. I would like to wish for better in different things. So we're going to upgrade this so we can have better wishes. Andrew, do you have your hand up?
Yeah, it's a little bit more theoretical. Since we're doing it, since these APIs require backend access, does that mean at this point, like most of the work is being done server side? Because before through the JavaScript, like it can be requested from that front end, like the client's requesting it, right? But
Right.
for this, most of it's done by us. So
Right.
so they have to do a lot less work in like loading the page, right?
The client does, but you have to do more.
Okay, sounds good.
So this is a little bit cynical, but that is honestly like a trade-off that you have to make sometimes. Like, who is paying for the computing power in this app? Like, if you have a bunch of high-paying customers that have high expectations for how your app should behave on their phone, then you probably want to like do as much computation on your server and get a beefy server so they can have a fast experience. But if you're building some kind of like freemium or like ad supported application that you're targeting to people that you don't think have a lot of money, you would probably build your server as cheaply as possible and then find ways to do extra processing on the client. But yeah, so that is a consideration, is who is doing the processing for this application, and like, does that meet our needs for the project? Courtney?
Can you go over line 22 for me again, please?
Mm-hmm. So remember, I installed the requests library, I imported it, but I aliased it. So we're going to call it HTTP client, because this is what we're going to use for sending requests from Django, just to avoid having a lot of similar terms in this file. So then we call the get method off of it, which lets us send a get request. And then it needs two other pieces of information. There's the URL that we're sending the request to. So that's our endpoint variable. And then this particular API requires authentication. So we can pass in this Oauth object that we've created with the Oauth library. So this was, again, just recommended from the Noun project documentation. I didn't know this up front, how to work with Oauth. I just read it from their docs and then pasted it in my code, and it seems to work as described. But yeah, this is another library I had to import to get that working. But then after it sends the request, we get a response that gets assigned to this response variable. And then I can try to access the specific data in it, like in a dictionary format or in plain text format or whatever I want. Does that help?
Yeah, so the best practice, would it just be import request and without the HTTP client? Like, is that more commonly seen? Or is it more normal to see that as HTTP client?
I think the most normal thing is just to make sure that other people can read your code however you need to get that done. So if I wasn't like using, if this file didn't also have these view handlers in it, I would probably just keep the name requests. But because we also have these view handler functions that have the word request as their input argument, I'm just afraid of getting confused over all these similar words in my file. So I want to use an alias to just make it easier to tell apart. I probably could have also used a different name for this request variable, but this is very conventional in Django, so I was kind of hesitant to change that. So it depends on what you have going on the page and who you think is going to be reading it and what you think will be hard for them to read.
Okay, and the endpoint and the auth equals auth, that is coming from the documentation of the API?
Yep, I didn't come up with that myself. This is their sample code for Python. I copy pasted it, just changed my keys, and it seems to work. Wow.
Thank you. I'm a little bit lost right now. I just want to clarify. Is that the only reason we're using that OAuth? Is because we're trying to get icons from that specific website that requires all those keys?
Right. So this website, Noun Project, requires us to sign in with a public and private key. It's kind of like a username and password. So those keys that I showed you here, Noun Project needs us to send these keys to them in every request so that they know who we are, so they can bill us accordingly.
So if we just use API to request icon from other website that doesn't require the username, so we don't necessarily need to use this OAuth.
Right. You won't need to use this for every API. So, you saw before, I requested data from this beer app. And here, this one doesn't require any authentication. So I just passed in the URL. There's no OAuth required. It's pretty simple. This one apparently has extra security on it. So I had to do the authentication with OAuth. Some other APIs that you'll encounter might have different authentication schemes. So I don't know how every API potentially works, but if you read their documentation, it should make it clear what's expected of you.
Okay, thank you.
Wow, a lot of chat. Jesse?
Just a quick point. So usually the authentication is really just so they get money from us mainly.
Money is part of it, because this API will start charging me after I send more than 5,000 requests in a month. So they need to keep track of how many requests I personally have sent so they know when to start billing me. It's also just to prevent abuse. Like if they see that they get 10,000 requests in a minute from the same API key, they're just going to ban that API key.
Oh, okay, good to know.
Yep. Bao?
Sorry, just another question. So if this one involved charges, like would be the reason we want to use this type of APIs, or like should we use this type of API in our personal project or something like that?
I mean, if you need to let users like type in words and then see pictures of that thing, this is one way you can do it. Or if generally you need to have a whole bunch of icons, but you can't really predict ahead of time what icons you're going to need and you want to just search for them by term, this can maybe help you. Honestly, I mostly chose to demo this API because it has, I think, pretty easy to read documentation. It's very easy to authenticate with compared to some others that I've worked with. And it's pretty easy to understand what it does, gives you pictures of things. But in terms of like a professional project where someone's going to like pay you $10,000 and they're like, there's no way we can build this app without the Noun Project API. Like, I'm not exactly sure what you would need this for, but it is kind of cool.
Okay, thank you.
So let's say I wanted to make this dynamic. I don't want my wishes to all be trash. So the problem is here, I've hard coded in this one. Maybe instead I would like to have a random image. So let's import random. Going to make this an F string. So allegedly they have thousands of icons, so 500 should not be outside of their range. So now I'm just requesting a random image though from that endpoint and then still just sending it straight through the client. Okay, so now we can wish for all kinds of different things. I guess I'm not wishing for it. It just has to read my mind and then know what I wanted, except I did not want mosquitoes. See a lot of pictures of stuff. Things, if you will, nouns. All right, so that's kind of the nuts and bolts of how you authenticate to an API. Does anybody have any questions just about how we got the data moving around? Courtney?
I'm kind of confused. If we were to upload this onto GitHub, wouldn't everyone be able to see our API key?
Yeah, they would. So what I'm doing here on line 20, this is super terrible. You should never do this in your own code. Just for the first time I'm showing you how to use an API, I've just hard coded the keys right into my code. Just so you don't have to like jump around between different places to see what's actually being passed in. But you're absolutely right that if at this point I committed this code and then pushed it up to GitHub, then my keys are in GitHub. So there are actually like lots of people who write bots that are just constantly looking through public GitHub repositories to find keys and then exploit people's accounts. And more recently, actually GitHub has bots exploring itself to find people who post their keys just so they can warn you. Like you might actually get an email from GitHub if you post code like this saying like, hey, you posted a private key, you should really take that down as soon as possible, or like change your keys and all that stuff. So yeah, that's actually the very next thing I would like to show you is how to properly manage these secrets so that they don't get committed in GitHub. But yeah, it's definitely a really good observation. Do we have any other questions? No more questions. Okay. I think that we are long overdue for a break. So why don't we come back at 11:10 and then I'm going to show you how to properly handle your keys. So now we're going to learn how to properly manage your keys, how to keep them stored securely, not in GitHub. So long story short, store private keys securely on the server with environment variables. This is a pretty industry standard solution. I feel like I've seen this in a lot of different places. Use environment variables to store data that should not be in the code. Now, what is an environment variable, you might ask? So an environment variable is a variable that's stored like on your system, in your operating system, like in Bash in your terminal. It's not specific to any application or project. They're not specific to Python, for example, but we can access them from Python. So first things first, if you want to look at your env, your environment variables, just from the command line, it's real simple. Just type env. So these are all the variables that I have declared on my system that I can just access at any time or that other scripts can refer to. So, I have this default set that's going to use VS Code for my term program. I'm not actually sure how that gets used. My shell is Bash. Some of you might be using ZSH instead. Username is here. So these are all the variables that are defined in Bash. So let's say users, Rafael Sirota. If I want to print out one of these, just echo and then $ means a variable in Bash. So that's how I see this environment variable in Bash. So the point is that environment variables are not specific to Python or any one language, but they are on your system itself. And so we're going to access these from Python. So let's see how we do that real quick. So like I said before, this is part of your operating system, these environment variables. So in order to access them, we're going to use the operating system module from Python. Import OS lets us interact with the operating system, file system in a few different ways. And actually just when the server loads, I want to print out os.environ. This is the only property on OS that I care about for today. Okay, so when I ran the server, it imports OS, prints os.environ, and this is what I get. It's a dictionary full of variables, but some of these might look familiar. So shell, spin bash, home, users Rafael Sirota. Here's my path variable. We talked about before. This is one of the more important environment variables. User is in here somewhere, but I'm not seeing it at the moment. So my point is just that these are the exact same variables that I just accessed a second ago from Bash, only now I'm able to view them from Python. So let me see actually, oops, I can set a new one. Looks like that didn't quite work how I was hoping it would. I was trying to set another environment variable that would be seen in Python. I might have to review some of my shell skills, so never mind that. The point is that these same variables we access at the shell and bash, we can get them in Python. So if I wanted, I could actually just set environment variables at the shell or declare them when I run Django, but that's not a very organized way to do this. Typically, we would want to declare these variables in another file so we can write them down in kind of an organized way. Now, there's a convention for this, that instead of using actual environment variables on your system, you'll use a text file called, well, I've already got one, but it's called .env. So the format is pretty simple. It's just key equals value. So I'm going to change this a little bit here. Say key equals grab that guy. And I'll say secret equals, and then we'll grab this guy. Okay, so now I've got both my keys in my env file. But also very important, before I forget, the very next thing I want to do is in my git ignore, I'm going to put .env to make sure that this one file that actually has all my secrets does not get committed in Git. So generally speaking, anything that doesn't belong in Git, any like secret keys and passwords and things, those things can go in your .env file. So we're ignoring that. Andrew, question?
You probably said this. Is that env file only for this specific project?
It's even more specific than that, actually. It's for this specific project running on my local machine right here. So if I was going to push this up to GitHub and then you wanted to like fork it and then play with it on your machine, it would not have an env file. You would have to create your own env file to define the environment on your machine. So for like this example, I wouldn't want you using my API keys because I get billed for that. I don't mind if you use the rest of my code, just don't use my API keys.
What you were also showing earlier with environment, is that the same thing as like the bash RC profile where we like originally put our Git password and username?
Right. That's like half the point of the bash profile is just to declare environment variables. So actually, let's see what's in my bash profile real quick. Oops. So what do? I declare PS1 CLI colors, LS colors. So let's see if we can see those. Yeah, so PS1, this is just what I had in my bash profile. Except since I have my virtual environment enabled, it like hijacks it, puts the name of the virtual environment in there. That's just your shell prompt. Yeah, LS colors, this was defined in my bash profile. CLI color, that's defined in my bash profile. I just saw a hand go up.
Well, yeah, I can ask my question once you're done explaining this part though.
I think I explained what I was saying.
Okay, so I have two questions. One is, so these new variables that you created, key, secret, those aren't variables that have already existed, right? Those are ones that you just created?
Correct.
Okay.
So these
And my
don't,
second- Yeah, sorry, continue.
so these don't actually exist in the command line, but in a second, I'm going to show you another Python module that we can use that kind of makes Django pretend like these are from the command line. Because we do want to use like the concept of environment variables, like variables that are different from one environment to the next, but it's sort of a hassle to actually just use bash variables like from a bash RC or whatever, bash profile. So I do want to have these defined in a file, but still like use the mechanism of environment variables. So this is like kind of a weird compromise there. These variables aren't actually defined like at the command line, but once Python gets running, it's going to be able to see these as if they were.
Okay. And then my second question is, so well, it's like a two-part question. One is, so this .env, is this like only going to exist in this particular virtual environment?
I wouldn't say it's part of the virtual environment, but it's part of the project on your particular computer. It's part of, let's say, like, it's part of this deployment of the project.
Okay.
So
And
like
could
when,
yeah, sorry.
when you deploy, like if you're testing this out, like in a pre-production kind of like staging server, you would have an env file just for that staging server to define how it's supposed to behave in that environment. When you actually deploy to production, you would have a separate env file for production that would specify like the actual like real API keys that your real app uses in production. So every place that the app is deployed to where you run it, you'd have a separate env file. It's a different environment. And even every individual developer who works on their local machine, that's a different environment where the app is running.
Okay. And then the second part to my question is, could you put .env in like your virtual environment folder? So like the same place where your virt folder is and all of those?
I don't think so. Django needs to be able to read this file. So it does need to be inside of this project folder somehow.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yep. I saw a few other hands up.
Thank you. So I guess it's a similar question, and I think you just answered it. So the .env file is just a file you created within your project folder.
Yep.
Is that correct? Okay, thank you.
Before you made the .env, you were telling us something about like foo. You were trying to put foo and like a secrets thing or something. I'm not sure what was happening there. If that's something that's important, could you cover it again?
I'm sorry, I'm not exactly sure what you're referring to. Is it something I did in my code or something I was doing at the command line here?
I think you were like trying to put a secret something in the, I'm not really sure. It was before you made the .env, you were trying to, we could do something.
Yeah.
Here's when you were trying to do it in the command line, like kind of showing that you were going to bash and setting up an environment variable in the command line.
Yeah.
Kind of, I think you're trying to explain what it is you're trying to do or simulate that Python would simulate those environment variables.
Yeah, that's right. So I was trying to define an environment variable at the command line with just like foo equals bar or whatever, and then hoping to see it inside of Python when I ran os.environ. But I'm guessing maybe that like, because this is in a different terminal tab, and then it doesn't see the ones that I defined over here. So I guess actually, What if I just try that here? Okay, so yeah, the problem was because I was running the command in a different terminal. So the variable wasn't created in the terminal session where Django was running. So here I just closed my server, set a variable foo equals bar, and then I started my server again. And now when Python prints os.environ, I'm able to see this key here, foo : bar. So this is just kind of an example of how I can declare a variable at the command line and then access it from Python, which is what we're trying to do here basically with environment variables.
So is that a different way to store your key? Like other than the .env, is that a different way to do it?
I'd say that this is the most natural and basic way. Like this is kind of the default way that environment variables work. But there are practical reasons why you don't want to be doing this, just because it's a lot of like typing at the command line. It's kind of finicky. It's a lot easier to just like use an env file. Like if you're getting onboarded at a new company and you're like, I can't run the app, I need all these keys and stuff. Like, how do I do this? You could just like Slack a coworker, be like, hey, could you send me your env file so I can get up and running? And so you just like paste that into your project and you're good to go, or good to start. Jesse?
Yeah, I was just double checking, seeing that because with the .env file, we're going to be importing that into the views.py, correct?
More or less.
So there's
We'll
still
be
a
able to
link.
access it on os.environ the same way we access any other environment variables.
Okay, so there's still a link between the two. So, I mean, I guess, all right, I'm just thinking security wise, but yeah.
Yeah, there is a link between them, but ideally someone who is just reading this code, like in GitHub, isn't able to see the key. So anyways, this last piece of this puzzle that we need in order to actually access the variables from our .env file in Python, we're gonna have to install another module. Install .env, which is a package that helps you manage the .env file. I don't know why this is taking so long, but it's already been installed in this project, I think, in this virtual environment. So this shouldn't even be necessary. Yeah, it's even saying using the cached version. Okay, anyways, you'll have to install it. I've already done it. Jesse, do you have a question?
Yeah, just real quick, are we installing it from the virtual environment or outside of that?
Yeah, you should be installing it into your virtual environment. So all the modules you use for a given project should be installed to the virtual environment that you're using for that project. So I checked at my command line here that I'm using the requests virtual environment. So after I saw that, I went ahead and installed .env with pip. John?
So on the link that you have in the notes, the pip install was python -env rather than just .env. Does that make a difference for versioning or anything?
I'm sorry, say it again.
So on the link that you have in the course notes for the pip install, it's python -.env rather than only pip install .env.
Like that you're saying?
No, no, it's a pip install.
Is that what you're talking about?
No, here, I'll. Do you even see the chat at all?
I'm not looking at it right now. I can check. Python Sol. Oh my gosh. Okay. You're right. I think there's a difference between the name of the package when you install it and when you require it. So I could have just checked the docs and gotten this, but thanks for pointing that out. Pip install python.env. Yeah, okay, so that worked. So that's the actual name of the package when you install it, python.env. When you actually import it though, you just call it .env. We'll say load.env. And then we just call that function. So basically what this does when I call this function is it takes the variables from the .env file and then adds them to our actual like OS environment. So after I call load.env, actually, let's just see what this print statement shows me. Okay, yeah. So now we're printing os.environ, and I can see the variables from my .env file are included here, such as key and secret. So now to use this API, we just use variables from the env file. Now let's just make sure that this still works. Key. That's right, it's a dictionary. Let's try that one more time. Okay, cool. So now I've restored the original functionality of the application. It gets me these random icons every time I refresh the page. But now this is much better. It's much more secure because I don't have the actual keys, especially the secret key, are not actually in my code. Now they are in the .env file, but that doesn't get uploaded to GitHub. That doesn't get committed in Git. So if some other collaborator wants to pull down this project, they're going to have to sign up for this API themselves, get their own keys, and add them to a .env file. But now I can safely commit this project now that I have removed the keys from any file that would be in Git. So yeah, that's how you manage keys. Roki?
Yes, my question is if I take your program and I'm trying to load your files, will I know that I have to insert the specific secret and key variables into the environment variable file?
You're saying if you just pull down the project and it doesn't have an env file, how do you know what variables it needs?
Exactly.
Okay, so here's a convention that I've seen in a few places that I've worked. So while the env file is not committed in GitHub, what is committed in GitHub is .env.example. And this is going to just look like something like this, or just just so that whoever clones this down from GitHub, they understand what data they're missing. So this would probably be database username, database password, API keys and such.
That answers my question. Thank you.
Great.
And they can just real quick, and they can just go into the views.py to get the link to get the keys right on the endpoint. And that's how a person who's downloading someone's GitHub would go about and getting the keys for themselves.
I'm sorry, can you say that again?
So, all right, say you're downloading this GitHub. I want to utilize the API. I know I need to get the keys and the secret. Do I utilize basically the code that's in the endpoint on line 26 to do that? Or is there another place where they would probably look at?
I mean, to get the keys in the first place, we're going to the website for the noun project.
Right. No, what I'm saying is if I was just a person taking this code off of GitHub and
Mhm.
I'm going to I'm gonna need to do new keys and stuff, would I know just to look at line 26 would be the way of me going about doing that? Or is there another easier way or a quicker way for me to say, oh, I just need to go to the noun project and go to here?
Just like, how do you know that you need keys to make this work?
Kind of
He's
like
talking
how,
about where to know where to go to find to generate your own keys. He's saying that by looking at, say, your endpoint on line 26 that has the link to your API call that you're making, I think he's asking, is that traditionally how other developers, when cloning a project, would find out where they can go and generate their own keys that they would use in that .env file?
yes, that's what yeah.
I mean, generally speaking, I assume that contacting an API requires some kind of key. Line 25 is probably a bigger clue, as all these os.environment variables. I would be really surprised if an application like actually use OS environment variables, other than like path and home, some basic things. But things like key and secret, I'm going to assume that this is coming from an env file. But like really the main way I would know that I need an env file to work with a project is by seeing if they have an example env file at the top level. Or you just run the project and see what crashes. I would say that sometimes especially in my experience projects that I've worked on, it is not always well communicated what exactly you need the env file for. And like what parts of the code require environment variables and what don't, or like which ones are optional, which ones are required. So there definitely is some ambiguity in that. Maybe there are better ways that teams can communicate to each other what environment variables are necessary.
I guess what I was trying to get at is with or without the passcode, what is the best convention of understanding which API someone is using so that me as someone who cloned it can say, oh, you're using this API, let me go over here and look at it so I can go and tinker. Is it the endpoint the best route, the best practice to look at it, or is there another way, or is there a README file that some programmers use or stuff like that?
I mean, the first thing I would look at is just the endpoint. Like, I know that this isn't on my own server. I don't own this, so this is someone else's server. I'm getting their data. But also, you know, for a professional project, it would be really good to have a README and just, you know, give new people clues or just information about how to use the project.
Perfect. Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you.
Most teams are really terrible about documentation, though. So sometimes these things can be outdated or misleading, but I'm hoping that you all do better than that. I think documentation is very important. I think it's worth spending time on. I would encourage you all to take it seriously. Is there another question?
Yeah, I was just gonna ask, so if you delete, so the .env file with the environment method or whatever, that's just appending the key and the secret, like it's not actually adding that to the actual environment profile, is it?
Yeah, so when I'm doing like load.env, this is letting Django pretend that these variables are environment variables so that when I call os.environ, I can access them. But if I try to access them from bash, I'm not going to be able to see, anything here.
Okay, cool. Yeah, that answers my question. Thank you.
Cool. Any other questions?
I was wondering if we were to deploy this website on like Heroku or GitHub Pages or something, how would the .env connect with like the config bars? Like where you type in the API onto, am I making sense?
Yeah, totally. So for a lot of those kinds of hosting solutions, like, you just give them a Git repository and you just say deploy this repo, and they kind of take care of all the other complexity for you. And even in more manual kind of solutions, you'll still do this. But so the idea is that you don't want to have your env file in the repo that you give to Heroku or wherever, for the reasons I've talked about. So Heroku is probably going to have their own dashboard in the website for environment variables. So, you like register an app in Heroku and you have to give them the GitHub URL for that app. And there's going to be a separate page where you just specify all the key value pairs of environment variables for that app. So it's going to be, the same data that I would put here, but I would just type it into Heroku's website. So a lot of other hosting providers have similar kinds of things. You can specify the environment variables like through a GUI in their website, and you're not actually like mucking around with env files.
Okay, and I'm also curious, like if you wanted to, instead of putting like key equals 5BC, whatever, could you put like the value of the key equal to the value of the secret instead of having key and secret there? Like, would that work?
I'm not sure if I understand you.
Instead of naming the key equal to the key, could you just have the value of the key equal to the secret? Like, yeah. Like, could that be equal to the, I was just curious.
No, I don't think it works this way.
Okay.
The env file has a pretty rigid format. It's a very simple file, just key equals value, as many of them as you need.
Cool. Okay, thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? This is
Yeah, you said key equals value as many as you need. So if you had multiple keys, would it be like key 1 to differentiate which key is which, I assume? Is that correct?
I mean, you can't have lists. It's just a whole bunch of individual keys.
Okay, so that's how you would, okay, great. And then secret 2 would be the password. Or secret 1, I'm sorry. For key 1 would be secret 1, and you would just continue on that naming convention.
Oh, so if I had multiple keys like that, I would probably give them more meaningful names. Like,
Okay.
Noun API key, noun API secret, other API key. We got other API secret. So yeah, you might be using multiple APIs in your application. So you should choose names that distinguish them from each other, just so you know what you're referring to. I know this might look kind of ugly because we're accustomed to using Python data structures and organizing our data in a little more pretty way. Like I'm sure you want to do something like this. Have a list of keys that are separate from your other variables. But unfortunately, the env file is much too simple for that. So we just have all of our individual variables in a list. Who else got some questions?
I have a question. What sites are we going to be using to deploy applications on?
I would like for all of us to deploy our applications on AWS EC2.
Okay, thank you.
It's a pretty simple deployment solution, but it is actually like genuine and proper and real. Like this is a real actual server that you're going to be deploying your application to. You're going to learn a little bit of DevOps along the way. I'm not a big fan of Heroku for a few different reasons.
I have a question as well.
Yep.
I don't know. Yeah. Could you go back to your views.py? And then, so the logic that you're performing, like to get the data, or like to get the icon, for example, could you do that same logic within your HTML file?
Like sending the request.
On line 31, icon, like, could you just send in a response JSON in like as data? Like instead of sending in icon URL, you send in response JSON. And then you like, could you get the icon there?
Yeah, for sure. I could totally do that. It doesn't really make the code any more complex because one way or another, I have to drill into this response and get the actual URL. So I can either do that in my view handler or in the template itself. But there are important questions to ask about where you want to keep your complexity. You know, even if the app has a given amount of complexity that you can't avoid, choosing where to put it and how you organize it can help. So in my opinion, I would really try to avoid putting complexity in your templates as much as possible. You know, just like iterate over a simple list or just display simple variables. If you really need to dig deep into a nested data structure or like filter a list or something, if it gets very complicated, you might want to just do all that logic in Python and then give a different data structure to the render method that's more precisely what you want to render. Because if you're just putting a whole bunch of logic in your templates, this can get really hard to read really fast. I guess these aren't good examples, but if you have a ton of logic in your templates, they're very hard to read. Ideally, HTML should be like almost a graphical kind of visual language. Courtney,
So,
sorry, Ed?
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just gonna ask, so do you recommend only sending in like, when you're sending in data to only send in like lists and like variables?
I mean, yeah, but as opposed to what?
Oh, just like dictionaries or like different types of data.
Yeah, I mean, you could also send in a dictionary, but the question is like, how deep do you have to dig into the dictionary in your template? If it's a pretty shallow dictionary and I only have to dig 1 or 2 levels in, I probably wouldn't mind just passing the whole thing in. But if I find that I'm digging like 8 levels deep into this dictionary, then I would probably rather fetch out the individual variables I need in my Python and then pass them in explicitly and then reference them inside of my template.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Courtney?
Could we use multiple APIs in that one wish method?
Did you ask, can you?
Yeah, like would it cause any problems?
I mean, who's stopping you?
Okay, cool.
So honestly, those are, in my opinion, some of the coolest kinds of applications are ones that'll use multiple APIs. So like in this case, you know, let's go up here. I'm requesting data from this beer API. And that's cool, I have access to all their data, but it's not gonna really tell me anything more interesting than what they already know. But if you can pull in 2 APIs and then like compare their data against each other, you might be able to like make some interesting comparisons. Like if you have one API that gives you historical weather data and another API that like, I don't know, gives you fashion advice based on the temperature, you could like make a calendar for someone, be like, these are good outfits you could have had in the past or something, you know, by combining the data from those 2 APIs. And so then even though it's none of your own data, you still produced an experience that neither of those 2 API developers would have predicted. So definitely go for it. You should totally be using multiple APIs if that makes sense to you for something you want to build.
So going off of that question, on line 25 auth, that can be anything that we assign it, right? Like a different word.
Yeah, I just chose this variable name.
Okay, cool.
Whatever, as long as it matches over here. That's all.
Okay, thank you.
Yep. Was there another hand up?
Yeah, it's me again. Another question dealing with actually the method with wish. Because I looked at your wishes.html and you're passing in data. And I'm just trying to figure out how we're passing in the icon with the HTML and rendering and all that. Is it just in this views.py where we're doing it?
Yeah, so just in this view right here, I get the icon URL from the response JSON, assign it to this variable icon URL. But then the dictionary that I pass into render, it's going to have one key. I'm calling it data. And then the value is icon URL.
Okay.
So just because that's the key. Maybe if I wanted to make my code a little bit simpler, I could just call this icon URL.
Oh, so that name doesn't matter.
Mhm.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Just as long as it matches everywhere. But so since I changed that to be icon URL, then
Okay, I see where they all connect now. Thank you.
cool. I'm glad. What more are we curious about?
I'm a little curious. So we're getting access to this icon data from the API. And say in our app, we want to be able to have a list of icons and the name of the icons and everything. So could one way to do that is to create a class for icon. And then when we pull in that data from the API, we map the data from the request into a class object.
Yeah, that could be pretty smart. Like as you can see here, I had to write a fair amount of code just to get one icon back from the API. And some of it is, or is it like some of it is not going to be repeated as much. Like, so yeah, I probably don't have to redeclare the auth if I'm just sending multiple requests to the same API. But if I'm sending multiple requests to different APIs, I would need different auth. But I would also need a different endpoint and then different response handling for every individual request I send. So yeah, I think this could be a good use case for object-oriented programming. You could probably
So would you put
abstract
the class, so would you separate that to a different view file? Or would that be a class and then you just import that class into this views file? I'm just like, I guess as the complexity of the app grows, like what would be the ideal way to want to structure that?
I would probably put the class in its own file. Generally speaking, if you've got a class that is just supposed to be like a helper kind of and assist you with doing other things, I would put it into its own file just for organization. And then, yeah, you would import it at the top here.
Perfect.
Did you say if you were going to use it as a class that you don't need to put the authorization code multiple times? If you're just getting, or you have to do it every time you're going to pull a icon?
Well, because imagine if I'm sending multiple requests to the icon API, it uses the same username and password because it's my same account to the same API. So I don't think I would need to do this multiple times. I could probably just declare the auth once because all the requests are going to use the same key and secret. The only thing that needs to change is the endpoint. So like maybe the class in a class variable would, or like in a static variable, would have the auth declared. So like when I create the class, it declares the auth. The individual like instances don't need that. But then I could create an instance with a specific endpoint passed in because that is actually different between requests. Saw another hand go up.
Yeah, so I guess just going forward, something like this would probably be either its own app that would probably get pulled in, or maybe a single page app for, obviously we're only doing a small project here. Would something like this be either better done as like an app that gets pulled into it later on, like a larger project, or something that maybe we would do in React just because it's such a small thing? I think Django probably, I think, is better at scale.
I'm sorry, are you talking about like a Django app? When you said like in its own app?
Yeah, I guess what I'm saying is like, so if we were to make a Django, if we would use that as our framework here, likely it would be because we have a lot going on, right? Because from what I understand, Django is kind of rough for these smaller projects. But say we had a larger project, now being able to move stuff dynamically is easier. So here we just have like a very simple project. But if we were to make this like maybe a small part of a larger project where, you know, maybe getting these icons is something that we do frequently across our site, then we'll kind of make its own app and then use that kind of to help out whatever we're doing there, or
Yeah, I think you've got the right idea. It really depends on the scale of your project. I always feel like the correct organization for any project depends on how much stuff you have to organize. So like if this was a giant project, but this was the only API call in the entire project, I would probably do it just the way I've done here, kind of all in this one view file. But if I was doing a whole bunch of API calls in like a bunch of different files to different APIs, that would get really messy real fast to have it all in the individual files making the calls. And so I would abstract that out into their own classes. Sound good?
yeah, it makes sense. Okay, yeah, it's just so small. It's a little awkward looking at all of this just to get an icon.
I mean, it's better than making the icon yourself, right?
Depends on who you ask.
Well, I'm not very good at drawing, so I like APIs. Courtney, do you have a question?
Can you remind me what the main JS is doing up there?
Right now, almost nothing. I basically just wanted to demonstrate that some APIs can be used from the front end and some can't. So we've just got this API request that will work, and then this API request that will not. That's all. Most of the demo has no front end code in it.
Okay, so if we wanted to use a front end API, would we do it with JavaScript in the same project?
You certainly could. You know, like in this case, let's say this one project needed both nouns and Pokemon. Like if the project needed both nouns and Pokemon, I would be pretty content to send the API requests for the Pokemon from the front end, just to avoid taxing my server any more than I need to. And because I'm able to do this.
Cool.
Yep.
Also, if we have time, could you show us how to loop through that API to show like a few icons?
So there's a couple ways we could do that. So this URL returns a single icon. I could just call it multiple times. They also have a different API or a different endpoint, icons, plural, that'll give you a list of icons. So that would give you a list that you can just loop over in Python. It's 11:57. I'm not sure if I've really got time to do a full demo of that, but it should totally be possible. Either just do one request that gives you a list and you can loop through it, or you could do multiple requests and then put those responses into a list. Actually, here, let me think for a second. Did I spell something wrong here?
Comma.
Oh yeah, always gets me. Okay. So should be able to do something like this. So I'm going to load the wish page again. Excuse me.
You have, I don't know if you're meaning to, but there's response on line 28 and then there's responses.
Right, yeah, I meant to make a different variable. So this should be a list that's going to include multiple responses. Not exactly sure what the issue is here. Hmm. I'm going to try it with this other API real quick. See if that makes any difference. Maybe the
Could you also
authentication.
try creating another variable like response one and then adding just the variables inside of the list? So
I guess I could do that too.
It's on my brain.
Not get that printed out. So it wasn't like that. Okay, so and you can do something like this. It's not like super elegant, I guess.
And you're only having to do this because you're calling one API call per one. You're only grabbing one icon per call, right? That's why you're doing it this way. Versus just doing like you were showing the other way where you can just pull in, I guess, a list of icons, and then I guess in the template you can pass in that data straight into the template and just look through it and show it on the page.
Yeah, in this case, the beer API does actually give me a list. So this isn't like super necessary. Well, I guess I'm still doing two different requests, so it'll be two different lists. Yeah, I'm still not sure what the issue is here.
Did you change your key?
Yeah, in your .env file.
Yeah.
Did I? Oh my gosh.
Good call, Rod.
Is that all it was? Wait. Okay. So it looks like I was able to send multiple responses at once, just declaring them right inside of this array and didn't create variables for each of them individually. Which means also I could create these API responses just like in a map or a for loop. So there are a lot of ways to like do a list of requests. Let's see here. My pretty printer is only printing depth of 2. So I'm not seeing a whole lot of information. Let's make this a little deeper. Cool. So now this is both of those API responses together. So here's the response for IPAs. Is that right? Yeah, so this is all the IPAs. Belgian IPA. Brown IPA. Okay, and then here that ends the list. And now we have another list because each API response was a list. So now we're looking at the responses for that second one for all the red beers. So Irish Red Ale, Red IPA, Flanders Red Ale. So yeah, if you have to send a lot of API requests at once, or if there's some like format, like, you know, you're doing a loop 1 through 10, sending 10 API requests, you don't need 10 variables for that. We can use the kind of the same dry principles that we've been practicing before, you know, in order to avoid repeating ourselves, having redundant variables, make our code elegant and readable. I definitely see code like this just like all the time in JavaScript. So I don't think this is super crazy. All right, any more questions? I know we're going over a little bit. No more questions? Everybody ready to get to lunch now? Sorry we didn't have any time for an exercise review today. Still did want to go over some of the work from the past week or so, but it's just so many questions, so much good content. So let's see. You are going to have a little bit of homework tonight. A couple of assignments for you. So first of all, so 2 assignments, they should both be relatively minor. So first of all, just to practice using APIs from the backend, I want you to recreate your Pokemon theme team in Django. So you're not going to use any JavaScript for this. It's all just going to be a regular page request to the home page. And then Django is going to send the HTTP request to the Pokemon API, do the same logic, but the syntax is going to be a little bit different because now you're doing it in Python with the requests library instead of doing it from the front end with Axios. But it's the same goal that we're trying to achieve, same requirements, just doing it on the server side instead of the client side. And then your second exercise is API show and tell. So this is mostly just about figuring out how to use an API that requires authentication. It's mostly just an exercise in reading documentation, actually. The actual application that I'm asking you to build is not at all complicated, really just a proof of concept that you're able to get data from an API in a Django application. But in order to do that, you're going to have to read the docs, get API keys, figure out how to authenticate to it, handle your keys correctly in the .env. So there's still a few moving pieces here. There's a lot to learn. It's not building a huge complicated Django application. We're just trying to prove that we can connect to an API. But also, I'm hoping that people will choose different APIs. And linked here, this public APIs list, but you might also just find another one somewhere else on the internet that you like. But ideally, you choose one that says CORS no, Because if it says yes for cores, then you could have used it from the front end. We want to make this meaningful and choose one that you had to access from the back end. Oh, so also choose one that specifies auth. So anything other than no, so API key. The one I used today was Oauth. There's a couple of different schemes, but just whatever it is, you got to read the docs and see what they expect from you. Kat?
Oh, I was just gonna say, does it kind of, I mean, obviously people can do whatever they want, but would it make sense to maybe start with this one to see if like we get, I feel like a lot of the new stuff that we learned is gonna be using the keys and all of that, which we don't need for the Pokemon one. So would
Right.
it make sense to start with this one and then like come back with, so we could ask questions during stand down if we have them?
You know, I suggested you do the Pokemon one first just because it's simpler, because the only challenge there is sending a request from the back end. And then for this other one, we add on top of that with you also have to authenticate. But if you think that you wouldn't have any trouble with the Pokemon exercise and you think that this one, API show and tell, would be a better use of your time, then by all means do them in whatever order you feel will be most useful. Sound good?
We're pair programming today, right?
Pardon?
Are we pair programming today?
You are pair programming today. I
So maybe
will.
Pokemon would be a good one for pair programming, and then the show and tell.
You think Pokemon would be better?
Well, if you wanted like more personal experience, so you got to choose your own API and work on it versus like the Pokemon one's more universal to everybody.
Yeah, that's a good point. I would rather people do the show and tell one individually. So we actually see 40 different APIs. And I want you all to individually struggle through reading documentation and figuring out how keys work, because it can be kind of a slog. But yeah, so why don't we do that one individually and then do the Pokemon one in pairs. Sorry, Kat, if that messes up your afternoon plans a little bit. All right, any last minute questions before we break for lunch? Going once, going twice. All right, great.